At the age of 54, Pedro Martinez is still regarded as one of the greatest legends that modern baseball has ever witnessed. A monument built from speed, transcendent skill, and a defiance of all physical limits. He is the owner of 3 Cy Young Awards, the man who produced one of the most perfect pitching seasons in MLB history with a 1.74 ERA, the heart of the Boston Red Sox, during the years they longed to break free from the 86-year curse that surrounded them. He has over 3,000 strikeouts, many classic games that people still talk about today as legendary footage, and was enshrined in the Hall of Fame in 2015 on his first ballot. No one, as small as he was, could dominate an era filled with giants who used raw muscle power to overwhelm opponents, and no one like him. A man weighing less than 80 kilograms could make the entire world wary with just his magical right arm. But beyond the numbers, Pedro also became a spiritual symbol for an entire generation of Latinos, proof that a poor boy from Managuayabo could still step into America and force it to listen, bow its head, and show respect. To the Red Sox, he was not just a player. He was the soul, the bolt of lightning that brought hope, the hero who forever changed the history of Boston sports. Yet, behind that glorious light were shadows that never left him. At 54, Pedro lives with a body worn down by time and glory to the point where he barely recognizes himself. A right shoulder that tears with pain every morning, a wrist that once threw 97-mile-per-hour pitches, now numb to the point of being unable to lift heavy objects, a back that aches so much he has to constantly shift positions just to breathe more easily. Those injuries did not begin after he retired. They are the aftermath of thousands of nights he pitched in silent pain, hiding everything so the team could rely on him. But physical pain is only a small part of the darkness Pedro carries. What haunts him more than anything is the memory of the Dominican Republic where he was born, where he left behind friends, neighbors, poor children who never had the chance he was lucky enough to get. He has witnessed too many loved ones pass away from illness, violence, and poverty, and each loss becomes another cut in his soul. The more successful he became, the more he felt indebted. And sometimes, in the silent nights, Pedro wonders, how can such a small heart bear all that pain? The pain of his own body, the pain of his homeland, and the pain of the souls he could not save. But that very question is the reason Pedro stands firm. He continues to fight, to love, to give, as if every step he takes is a reminder that true glory does not lie in titles, but in the ability to endure everything and still keep giving hope. If Pedro's journey full of both glory and pain has touched your heart, please subscribe so you don't miss the next parts. And right now, let us move on to the next chapter of this epic story. Managuayabo, the place where Pedro Martinez let out his first cry, was not a peaceful town with tree-lined streets and the sound of children laughing every afternoon. It was a piece of land that many people in the United States could not even imagine. Poor, to the point where the ground cracked dry underfoot. Houses with perforated tin roofs, the smell of sewage and dirty water mixed in the air, and children running barefoot on ground, hot as fire, because they had no shoes to wear. There, clean water was a luxury that only a few lucky homes had. Most people drank yellowish water from rusty pipes, carrying countless germs inside them. Gang violence crept into every street corner, like a ghost always lurking. Every night, Pedro heard screams, the roar of motorcycles, gunshots mixed with women's cries. Children in his neighborhood died like candles snuffed out by the wind, not from any major accident, but simply from basic illnesses like fever, diarrhea, infections, things that in the United States could be cured with one pill, but in Managuayabo could kill someone in a few days. Pedro grew up amid small funerals, makeshift coffins placed on the dirt ground, lidless, flowerless, only mothers wailing in despair over the child they had just lost. He did not just hear about death. He looked it straight in the eye, touched it, lived with it throughout his childhood. In the small house where Pedro lived with his father, mother, and siblings, hunger was not an empty feeling, but a stomach-twisting pain. A hunger that forced the skinny boy to drink water, to forget the emptiness in his belly. Pedro's mother was the soul of the family, a gaunt woman whose face was always etched with worry lines, her hands calloused from manual labor in wealthy villas outside the city. She worked from dawn until dusk, toiling like a shadow, just to earn a few coins to buy rice and beans for the whole family. Every day when she came home, she was so exhausted she could barely stand, only leaning against the wall to take long, broken breaths. But no matter how drained she was, she still tried to smile at Pedro, a weak smile, but enough to light up the house for a few brief seconds. Pedro's father was different, a quiet man with a perpetually stern face, eyes that always seemed to be weighing something larger than his own life. He was not the kind of father who hugged his children, not the type to say gentle words. The pressure of feeding a large family made him gruff, sometimes short-tempered, sometimes silent to the point of becoming distant. Pedro often saw his father sitting alone in the yard, shoulders slumped, as if carrying the whole world on his back. In that house, Pedro once said a phrase that haunted him for life. "Our house has nothing but hunger and hope." Hope was the only thing that kept them alive. Hope that tomorrow there would be work. Hope that dinner would be enough for everyone. Hope that the sick sibling would pull through. But hope was fragile like a candle in the wind, while hunger was present every day like an uninvited guest who never left. Pedro forever remembers the sight of his mother dividing the food, saving the smallest portion for herself. He remembers the whole family sleeping on a thin mattress, lying piled on top of each other to stay warm. He remembers the times he saw friends in the neighborhood die young, and the fear surging in his chest when he thought tomorrow it could be his turn. The most terrifying thing in Pedro's childhood was not the empty stomach or the gunshots in the street. The most terrifying thing was having no future. In Managuayabo, the future for a poor boy usually had only three paths: die young, join a gang, or leave everything behind to seek life elsewhere without knowing if he would ever return. Pedro looked around, saw children his age already doing heavy labor, saw older teenagers caught up in drugs or arrested, saw the desperate faces of adults. In the mind of that 8-year-old, 10-year-old, then 12-year-old boy, there was only one thought: how can I make sure I don't disappear in this place? With no light, no way back, no support, Pedro had only one thing left to cling to: an old softball, soft as a rag that he treasured like a jewel. The ball field was the only place he felt he existed. And from that darkest place, a small flame began to smolder, a flame that would take the boy from Managuayabo to America, to history. But before that could happen, it had to burn through the darkness, through poverty, through things no child should ever have to endure. Pedro Martinez entered life from hell, but that very hell forged a legend. But the darkness of Managuayabo was only the beginning. When Pedro entered his teenage years and began seriously pursuing his baseball dream, he realized that the world outside was far more cruel. If at home Pedro fought hunger and violence, then on the path to professional baseball, he had to face a different enemy: contempt. The first scouts who saw Pedro all had the same reaction. They laughed. Not an affectionate laugh, but the cold kind from people who believed they had already predicted the rest of a skinny, dark, frail boy's life. One of the phrases Pedro heard most often, to the point it was branded into his heart like a hot iron, was, "This kid is too small. Don't waste time." Some even said it right to his face, without hesitation. "A Dominican like this? Weak, fragile. He'll never make the major leagues." Those words were like stones thrown straight at Pedro's heart, each one a cut, each mockery a new wound. Pedro cried many times, not from humiliation, but from helplessness. He didn't know what to do to make them see him differently. He trained until his hands went numb, until his shoulder ached sharply every night. But when he showed up for tryouts, all they still saw was a boy, 5 feet 11 inches tall, but so skinny he looked like 5 feet 3, weighing less than 70 kilograms, standing on the field like a thin shadow. There were days Pedro walked nearly 10 kilometers just to reach a training field where an American team scout was present. He stood in line under scorching sun, waiting for his turn to pitch. And when the chance came, it ended in just 5 minutes. They watched the first pitch. The headshake appeared. By the third pitch, they waved him off, scribbled a few lines in their notebook, and told Pedro they had seen enough. Less than 5 minutes. But for Pedro, those were 5 minutes that made his world collapse, because he had spent his entire childhood preparing for that moment. But Pedro's pain was not just in being undervalued. It was in being seen as cheap Dominican goods, a kind of discrimination that poor children from this small island had to hear their whole lives, that they were only good for manual labor, that they lacked education, discipline, intelligence, to become stars in America. Pedro carried the voice of his homeland, but Americans only saw a tiny black boy who spoke broken English. He felt like an outsider, belonging nowhere, too poor to be respected in America, too dreamy to be believed in the Dominican Republic. This loneliness choked him, making Pedro wonder many times whether he should give up the dream and return to Manoguayabo, back to poverty and the dusty roads where he was born. Yet in that thick darkness, there was one single point of light, his older brother, Ramon Martinez. Ramon was the only one who never let Pedro believe what others said. Every time Pedro came home with red eyes from rejection, Ramon would drag him out to the backyard, to the dirt and rock field they had built together since childhood. He would put the glove in his brother's hand, place the ball in his palm, and say, "Throw, throw, until you make them shut up." Ramon trained Pedro himself, teaching him every body twist, every breath, every way to control the ball, as if controlling his own destiny. Ramon saw in Pedro what no one else did, a raw genius, a fire that could light up 50,000 fans in a stadium. Thanks to Ramon, Pedro did not give up, but that did not erase the psychological wounds he carried. Every time someone said too small, he remembered the poor children in his neighborhood he had once buried. Every time someone told him not good enough, he thought of his mother's face, gaunt after a long day of labor but still trying to smile, trying to believe that her son had a future. Pedro was not just pitching to make the team. He was pitching to repay a debt, to fight for those who had no chance to fight. But the more he pitched, the more it hurt. And the more it hurt, the more he feared that he would never escape the fate the world had imposed on Dominican children. And it was from the doubts of others, from the humiliation in tryouts that lasted only a few minutes, that Pedro's heart was torn apart for the first time. But from that, his will became sharp as a blade that would cut through prejudice and open a path no one thought he could walk. When he finally signed a minor league contract with the Dodgers, Pedro thought the door to his dream had opened. But what awaited him was not a road to the major leagues, but another hell, colder and more lonely than even the days in Manoguayabo. In the eyes of the white American players in the minor league system, Pedro was just a Latino kid brought in because of his famous older brother. They did not see him as a teammate, let alone a competitor. They looked at him with contempt, as if his presence dirtied the team. And so, Pedro entered a world where every day was a silent battle. Not a battle on the field, but a battle against being humiliated, belittled, and erased from everyone's memory. The dormitory where Pedro lived was little more than a run-down shed. The mattresses were white with mold from dampness, the walls covered in insect marks, the windows riddled with holes from storms. At night, the sound of rats running under the wooden floor made him curl up in fear that they would crawl onto his legs. Pedro did not dare call home, afraid his mother would hear him sigh, afraid she would know he found this place even more terrifying than Managuayabo. Here, poverty was not the greatest enemy. The greatest enemy was absolute loneliness. Far from home, far from family, far from the laughter of the little kids in the neighborhood, Pedro felt as if he had been thrown into a world of people stronger, richer, and far colder. In the locker room, he often sat in the far corner, hugging his glove bag to his chest like the last piece of home he had left. On the field, Pedro was treated like someone unworthy. Coaches made him train twice as hard, pitch twice as much, run twice as far, and the American players mocked him every time he failed in strength exercises. "He's weak as a noodle," they shouted. "This Latino will never throw 90 miles per hour," they jeered. Then they all laughed loudly together, never knowing that each word was like a punch to the deepest part of Pedro's heart, where he hid his childhood wounds. And the cruelest part, they stole his things. Shoes gone, glove gone, practice shirt gone. Anytime Pedro left his stuff in the room, he had to accept that he might lose everything. No one protected him. No one asked what he needed. No one saw him as a human being. But the most painful thing was being treated like an outsider. When the whole team gathered for dinner, no one called him. When they talked on the bus, no one invited him in. When they paired up for drills, no one stood next to him. Pedro often stood alone on the field, throwing balls against an old crumbling wall, each rebound echoing like a voice from his life. "You don't belong here." Each day passed as a series of grueling workouts. When Pedro was so tired he could barely stand, the coach yelled in his face, "Do you want to make the major leagues or not? Keep going." His shoulder hurt to the point of numbness, but they still made him pitch. Pitch until his arm lost all feeling. Pitch until his head spun and his eyes blurred with tears. There were sessions where Pedro collapsed to the ground, sweat and tears mixing together. But he did not allow himself to stop, because he knew if he stopped for a second, they would use it as a reason to cut him forever. At night, when the dormitory room was filled only with the rattling of an old fan, Pedro lay staring at the cracked ceiling. In the darkness, he whispered to himself, "No one wants me here." And that truth hurt so much, he felt his heart being squeezed. He missed home, missed his mother, missed Ramon, missed the familiar noisy poverty of Managuayabo. He missed everything that made him feel like he existed. And here in a dormitory cold as stone, he felt completely invisible. But it was in nights like those, when Pedro was close to giving up, that Ramon's voice echoed in his head. "Throw, little brother. Throw until they have to remember your name." Pedro clenched his fist, feeling the calluses on his skin, the wounds that hadn't healed yet, and promised himself that no matter how many people doubted him, no matter how many despised him, he would keep getting up, to live, to fight, to escape the hell of the minor leagues, to prove that a small Latino boy could make the whole world look again. Those months in the minor leagues tore Pedro into two halves, one half unbreakable steel will and the other a fragile body screaming in pain. The ball field was no longer the only home the poor boy had once known. It became the place where Pedro's body betrayed his own dream. Every morning when he woke up, it took him several minutes just to lift his right arm off the bed. His shoulder hurt as if someone was slicing into it with a knife, every movement causing his joints to make silent cracking sounds. There were days when Pedro reached up to touch his shoulder and felt like there was a hard rock right under the skin. A reminder that his body was crying for help every minute, every hour. His right wrist, the lifeline of a pitcher, was swollen like a tennis ball. Every time he held the ball, his knuckles trembled slightly, as if the nerves had been ravaged after thousands of high-speed wrist snaps. When throwing a change-up, Pedro clearly felt the pain shoot from his wrist up his arm and straight into his shoulder, sharp enough that sometimes he had to bite his lip until it bled to keep from screaming in the middle of practice. But even as his body screamed like that, Pedro did not dare say a word to anyone. In the world of professional baseball, especially for undersized Latino players, injury was not sympathy. It was a death sentence. Once they found out he was hurt, they would scratch his name before he even knew what was happening. One time, the pain became too much to bear. Pedro was called to see the team doctor after a session where he pitched until he collapsed on the field. When the doctor rotated his shoulder, Pedro gritted his teeth so hard his back tensed, sweat soaking his forehead. After a few minutes of examination, the doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, eyes serious. "Pedro, if you keep going like this, you'll be crippled. Not just unable to pitch, you could lose the ability to lift your arm forever." That was the kind of statement that made many players stop, choose safety for their future. But Pedro just lowered his head, sighed, and said in a quiet but determined voice, "I don't have any other choice." He knew full well if he rested a week, they would replace him. If he rested a month, his career would end. And if he rested forever, his home would lose the person trying to pull the whole family, the whole poor neighborhood, out of the abyss. After that visit, Pedro began pitching as if each throw was a slow suicide. He hid bandages under his shirt, wrapped his shoulder in hot towels, then ice, depending on the pain level. No doctor, no painkillers, no recovery therapy, just will, and the fear of returning to Managuayabo empty-handed. The most heartbreaking scene, the one Pedro would never forget, happened after a high-pressure game. He had thrown nearly 120 pitches with his shoulder almost numb. When the game ended and the team walked into the locker room, Pedro forced a smile, nodded congratulations to his teammates. But as soon as the door closed behind him, his body collapsed like a building bombed from the inside. He lay convulsing on the cold tile floor, both arms clutching his right shoulder as if it was about to fall off his body. The pain ran from his shoulder up his neck, down his back, spreading so intensely that he dry-heaved repeatedly. Sweat poured out everywhere, mixed with tears that Pedro tried to hide. A teammate walked in, froze at the sight of him curled up. But when the guy asked, "Are you okay?" Pedro immediately pushed himself up, forced himself to stand, flashed a twisted smile. "I'm fine, just a little tired." That smile, a forced, trembling smile, painful to the point his lips turned pale, was the image that captured Pedro's entire time in the minor leagues. A body on the verge of breaking, a heart that never surrendered, and a man trading himself away so his dream could live. The pains that tormented Pedro every day seemed like they would end his career right in the shadows of the minor leagues. But life pushed him into an unexpected turning point. The Dodgers, the team that once saw Pedro as a tag-along gift with Ramon, as a failed experiment, decided to trade him to the Montreal Expos almost without a second thought. To many in the organization, kicking Pedro away was no different from clearing out useless clutter. They saw no value in a 77-kilogram pitcher, skinny as mist and plagued by constant injuries. When he heard the news, Pedro just stayed silent. No crying, no anger, but inside him was a deep cut, being treated like trash, doing so much, enduring so much pain, fighting until his body nearly collapsed, and in the end, it still wasn't enough to earn respect. Montreal was like another planet to Pedro. The first time he set foot in the city, covered in white snow, he just stood looking at the gray sky and took a deep breath, the cold air cutting into his lungs. Everything here was cruelly unfamiliar. Different language, different culture, harsh weather, as if wanting to push strangers back to where they came from. In the Dominican Republic, Pedro grew up with scorching heat, the noisy laughter of neighbors, the sound of balls hitting stone walls, while Montreal was cold, silent, and closed off to the point he felt lost in a world not meant for him. In his first days there, Pedro was so lonely he was nearly depressed. No family, no friends, no Ramon beside him to pull him up every time he fell. He lived alone in a small rented apartment with no furniture, just a mattress, a heater, and a radio playing programs he didn't understand. Every evening after practice, Pedro took off his shirt, looked at his shoulder in the mirror, and saw it swollen red from both the cold and old injuries flaring up. He asked himself, "Am I strong enough to start over from zero in a world where no one knows me?" But Montreal was also the place where all the pain, hurt, and humiliation from the Dodgers was distilled into one single thing: fire. Pedro trained in silence, without complaining, without demanding anything. He just threw, and threw, crafting each pitch as if pouring all the years of being belittled into one single vortex. And in the 1997 season, all of America was stunned when the small man discarded by the Dodgers became the most dangerous pitcher in MLB. Pedro exploded. Not an ordinary explosion, but one that burst like a bomb hidden under the cold ice of Montreal. In 1997, he won the Cy Young Award with terrifying stats: a low ERA, relentless strikeouts, performances that forced the entire league to bow in respect. And then there was the near-perfect game, the one where Pedro was just one final hit away from a complete no-hitter. When he walked off the field that day, even the usually cold Montreal fans stood up. They did not just cheer him. They looked at him with different eyes. The eyes Pedro had waited his whole life for: recognition. But the moment that truly turned Pedro into a legend happened in the harshest place: Yankee Stadium, the ballpark of the eternal enemy, where every small pitcher was swallowed whole by mocking whistles and the arrogance of New York fans. The moment Pedro stepped out of the bullpen, the boos erupted in unison. "Go back to your island. You'll break in half, tiny Pedro." Those words pierced like needles through his skin. But Pedro did not flinch. He looked up at the stands, not with anger, but with the cold eyes of a warrior far too accustomed to being underestimated. Then he stepped onto the mound and threw pitches that even Yankees fans had to choke on. Fastballs slicing through the air like bullets, change-ups vanishing from sight like magic, curveballs dropping like a reaper's scythe. Pedro was not just pitching, he was taking revenge on himself. On the tear-filled minor league nights, on the tryouts rejected after 5 minutes, on the too small he had heard throughout his childhood. When the game ended and the Yankees walked off with heads down, Pedro strode away amid boos that choked in their throats, curses turning into heavy silence. And in that moment, he understood he had just crossed a boundary that all of MLB would remember forever. A skinny boy from the Dominican Republic had defeated Yankee Stadium with nothing but a heart that refused to surrender. Montreal was not home, but that cold place had turned Pedro into something the world could no longer deny: a legend born from ice, loneliness, and pain. Montreal had turned Pedro into a warrior, but it was Boston that turned him into a legend forged by pressure, hatred, insane expectations, and the passionate love of a city rich in tradition but full of cracks. When the Red Sox signed Pedro in 1998, all of Boston erupted. They did not just sign a pitcher, they signed a savior, a final ray of hope to break the 86-year curse, an obsession that had haunted the city from generation to generation like an unhealable wound. But alongside that hope was the giant shadow of despair. Bostonians were far too familiar with failure. They were far too used to watching the Yankees celebrate over them, and they were tired of promises. When Pedro arrived, they wanted him to do what no one dared say out loud: carry all of history on his back and snap it with one small arm. But Boston, at that time, was not an easy place for a Latino, especially a small but fiery Latino like Pedro. The city was deeply divided by race. White players had priority, while Latinos were seen as second-tier labor, cheered when good, torn apart on talk shows and in newspapers after just one bad game. Pedro entered Boston in that context, carrying a mission no one dared claim, but everyone awaited: defend the city's honor and pave the way for the Latino community that had been belittled for years. A famous former Red Sox player once said something Pedro remembered for life. Only Pedro could handle this pressure. Anyone else would break in the first week. That was not a compliment. It was a prophecy about the years Pedro would face. Years where every game was not just play, but a test of dignity, self-respect, and spirit for millions. Boston loved Pedro, but they could hate him overnight. When he won, they called him a god. When he lost, they saw him as a criminal. Pedro understood that better than anyone. He knew Bostonians loved victory to a cruel degree, and he knew that every time he stepped on the mound, he was not just playing for the team, he was playing for a city, always teetering on the edge of despair. A city bearing racial wounds that had never healed. In Boston, Latinos faced daily jabs. When Pedro arrived at practice, he heard whispers treating him like a gamble. Conservative fans said outright, they should have signed someone bigger, whiter. But Pedro did not back down. He threw each pitch like a punch against prejudice, like an answer to the world. I come from the Dominican Republic, and I come to win. The games Pedro pitched for the Red Sox were not just athletic. They were political, social, historical. Every time he beat the Yankees, Latinos in Boston partied in the streets. Every time he won a big game, immigrant children looked at him with eyes lighting up as if their own futures were pitching alongside him. Pedro knew that, and that made him heavy to the point of suffocation. But Pedro's greatest burden came from the most painful place, the nights Boston turned its back on him. When the Red Sox lost an important game, Pedro walked off the field amid boos and curses thrown in his face like stones. Too small, not strong enough, he can't break the curse. Those words were not just cruel. They stabbed deep into wounds Pedro had carried since childhood. There were nights after a loss when Pedro drove around Boston for hours, not daring to go home for fear of seeing the next morning's headlines, calling him a disaster, a disappointment, or worse, a mistake. He once admitted that there were nights lying in a hotel room, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering if he was the right man for Boston, if he was strong enough to lead the team past the curse, if he had the strength to bear a city's rage when everything fell apart. But every time he thought of giving up, Pedro remembered Managuayabo, remembered his mother, remembered the Dominican children still looking to him with hope. And so he got up again, trained again, threw until his shoulder felt like it would tear apart. Boston was hell, but Pedro turned that hell into a sacred temple where he vowed to fight to the end. For Boston, for the Dominican Republic, and for the poor boy he once was, who stood watching rain through a perforated tin roof, wondering if he would ever be recognized. In Boston, Pedro was not just a pitcher. He was a flame defying fate itself. And that flame prepared him for the greatest moment of his life, the moment that would change everything forever. In Boston, Pedro did not just fight the Yankees, the curse, the insane expectations of the entire city. He also fought the most dangerous enemy, his own body. In the early years, the pain was just mild aches after each game. But at his peak, when Boston needed him most, when the whole city relied on every pitch to kindle the final hope, Pedro's body began to break down bit by bit. A quiet medical check, not announced to the media, revealed what Pedro had always feared but ignored for months. His right shoulder was torn 30 to 40%. A normal pitcher with a tear like that would immediately stop playing, go on the injured list, and prepare for surgery. But Pedro knew if he rested just one day, if he missed just one game, Boston would collapse. And he also knew Latinos were not allowed to stop, not allowed to be weak, not allowed to complain about pain. So Pedro kept pitching, in silence, in despair, and in pain no one could imagine. Every 96-mile-per-hour fastball he threw was not just a pitch. It was a knife stabbing straight into the tear in his shoulder, widening it millimeter by millimeter. Pedro heard a small crack every time his arm completed its circle, the sound of joints betraying him, tendons stretched to their limit. But he did not stop, could not stop, was not allowed to stop. Every game was a gamble with fate, and Pedro bet his own body on the table to stake everything. Every night after a game, Pedro returned to his small apartment in Boston with a body like a pile of rubble, his shoulder swollen to twice its normal size, burning hot like glowing coals. To ease the feeling of being burned alive on the spot, Pedro wrapped himself in ice packs from neck to stomach, each pack stacked on top of the others like the armor of an exhausted warrior. He lay motionless for hours, shivering from the cold, lips bitten until they bled, just to somewhat reduce the fire raging from within. There were nights Pedro fell asleep on the floor because he lacked the strength to crawl into bed. There were nights he woke up amid the chill rising from melting ice, feeling as if his body was rotting from the shoulder down the back. But what hurt Pedro the most was not the physical pain. It was the loneliness. Loneliness that suffocated him. Loneliness so deep he dared not share it with anyone, because just a hint of weakness, a bit of complaint, a single admission, and everything would end. No one on the team understood his pain. No one knew that every pitch Pedro threw was a gamble on whether his shoulder would shatter right on the field. No one knew he had to use his left hand to dress himself after each game. No one knew he had to lean against the wall just to raise his arm to shoulder height. Only Pedro knew. Only his body understood. And that very isolation was killing him from the inside. There were terrifying moments when Pedro believed he would die on the field. Once, after a particularly powerful fastball, a surge of pain shot from his shoulder up his neck, making his vision go black. His right arm went completely numb, as if it no longer belonged to his body. Pedro stood on the mound, fans roaring, opponents watching, catcher signaling, but in his head there was only one thought: I'm going to collapse right here. But he still threw the next pitch, and another, and one final one to end the inning. When he stepped into the dugout, Pedro nearly collapsed. Whatever his teammates said, he didn't hear. Whatever the coach asked, he didn't answer. All he felt was the pounding in his chest and his own hot breath, the breath of a man fighting the final limit of survival. To Boston, Pedro was a hero. To his teammates, he was a Superman. But when night fell, in a dark room lit only by a dim yellow bulb and surrounded by ice packs, Pedro Martinez was just a man breaking apart day by day, trading his health, his future, even his life, to bring hope to a city that had no idea how much he hurt. In 2004, all of Pedro's wounds, both physical and spiritual, were pushed to their absolute limit when Boston entered the historic ALCS against the Yankees, a series the entire country saw as a reckoning. When the Red Sox fell behind 0-3, Boston descended into frenzy. Newspaper headlines called it the end of an era of failure, and fans began looking for names to blame. Even though Pedro was not the cause, even though he pitched with a shoulder almost completely torn, thousands still looked at him as if he had betrayed the city. They forgot he had carried Boston for years. They forgot he had sacrificed his youth, his body, to fight for this uniform. In those dark days, Pedro felt vividly what legends before him had faced: the cruelty of hope. Then came the games America would never forget. Game 5, Game 6, Game 7. Boston began an unimaginable comeback. And while the world saw it as a miracle, Pedro knew that miracle was built from his own bones. Every time Pedro stepped onto the mound at Yankee Stadium, a sea of New York fans screamed in his face, words that would make any human want to crumble. Pedro is our daddy. Go back to the island. Tiny baby Pedro. Those chants were not just mockery. They were knives aimed at the poor Managuayabo boy inside him. The child once waved away by scouts, once seen by Americans as cheap Dominican goods. But Pedro did not tremble. He stood in the middle of Yankee Stadium, where the strong dominate, where noise can crush a mental fortress, and looked straight into the stands, as if staring into his own destiny. He did not smile, did not respond. He just gripped his glove tighter and told himself, I survived the minor leagues. This noise can't kill me. Boston, meanwhile, became an emotional battlefield. The people saw Pedro as the savior, the only one who could break the 86-year curse that had kept the city in darkness for nearly a century. But those same people, with just one small mistake, would see him as the scapegoat, someone who could be torn apart by the venomous words of the press. Pedro understood that. He had understood it for a long time, and that was why, when the team needed him most, he stepped up not for glory but because he knew if he didn't stand, no one else was strong enough to stand in his place. Then the unimaginable happened. Boston won 4 straight games, completing the greatest 0-3 comeback in United States sports history. The Yankees knelt. Boston exploded. The curse, a ghost that had weighed on the city for 86 years, finally began to crack. And then the 2004 World Series arrived. The Red Sox swept the Cardinals and claimed their first championship since 1918. All of Boston erupted like an emotional storm. But Pedro, who had contributed with blood, tears, and parts of his body now ruined, did not shout like his teammates, did not jump, did not smile. He stood alone on the field, looking around as if unable to believe that finally, he had been freed from the burden this city had placed on his shoulders for the past 7 years. Then, his tears fell heavy drops, not from joy, but from painful relief. Relief because he had done what Boston had waited generations for. But pain because he knew this victory was built at too great a cost. The lifespan of his career, his arm, his health, and all those nights lying alone with ice biting into his skin. Release was the only word that could describe that moment. But it was not release from the Yankees, from the curse, or from the pressure. It was release from Pedro's own deepest fear, the fear that he would die on the field without having done what he was born to do. When his teammates ran out to hug him, Pedro just shook his head, unable to speak. They thought he was emotional from the win, but only a few understood the truth. Pedro was not crying from victory. He was crying from pain, from exhaustion, from depletion, because finally he could collapse without feeling guilty toward the entire city. Boston called it joy. But to Pedro, it was ultimate release, a glory paid for with pain that reached his very soul. 2004 was not just the year the Red Sox broke the curse. It was the year Pedro Martinez broke his own chains. After the moment of release in 2004, Pedro entered a new chapter in his career, one without magic, without immortality, only a broken body fighting time. When he signed with the New York Mets in 2005, people expected him to bring the Boston Fire to Queens. But they didn't know that when Pedro put on the Mets uniform, he had entered the final stage of his war with his own body. In Boston, Pedro pitched in pain. With the Mets, he pitched in ruin. The arm that once carried the power of an entire city was now just remnants. Every pitch in Queens was a reminder that Pedro's body had exceeded the limits a human could endure. Blood vessels in his shoulder bulged as if ready to burst. Sharp pains cut deep into the bone, forcing him to pause in the bullpen to breathe desperately. Teammates looked at him and knew he was no longer the invincible Pedro of Montreal or Boston. But Pedro foolishly, loyally, tragically, still tried to smile, still said, "I'm fine. Let me throw a little more." But the body could no longer lie. In 2006, after a series of injuries stretching from shoulder to groin to calf, Pedro was forced to undergo major surgery, a procedure where the doctor said bluntly, "After today, you'll never be the same." They didn't just repair tendons. They didn't just fix one tear. They rebuilt entire parts of the body destroyed after nearly 2 decades of pitching in desperation. When he woke up from surgery, Pedro could not lift his hand. His entire right arm lay motionless like that of a stranger. He looked down at his body, covered in bandages, needle marks, bruises under the skin, and knew this might be the end. The months that followed were the darkest months of his life. No cheers, no teammates, no lights. Just him, alone in a rehabilitation room, trying to lift his arm like a child, using his hand for the first time. Every movement was a streak of pain running down his spine. Every sound from the exercise machine, a reminder that his career was crumbling like dust in the wind. Pedro had once stood before tens of thousands, defying all of Yankee Stadium. But now, he trembled, trying to lift a ball weighing less than half a pound. And then, in that very darkness, Pedro faced the most painful question of his life. The question every athlete dreads having to consider. If I no longer have baseball, what do I have left? Like Simon Cowell once spiraled out of control due to an accident and surgeries, Pedro also entered a period of disorientation. He no longer knew who he was without the field. No more sound of the catcher's glove thudding. No more sound of the ball hitting the net. No more Dominican children looking at him like a miracle. Everything sank into the darkness of a cruel truth. Pedro was becoming the person he feared most, a leftover after the spotlight. There were nights when Pedro lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, as he had once done in the minor leagues. But this time, the pain was not in his shoulder, not in his wrist. It was in his heart. The feeling of loss, losing himself, was more painful than all the physical injuries he had ever endured. He did not know what he still had to fight for, did not know what meaning he had beyond baseball, did not know if there was still light ahead. But he still breathed, still opened his eyes each morning. And though the darkness of retirement was enveloping him, Pedro never allowed it to completely swallow his soul. The darkness swallowed his body. But that warrior's heart, though torn, though weary, still refused to surrender. After the years of a shredded body and broken spirit with the Mets, Pedro returned to the Dominican Republic, back to the land that had given him birth, raised him, and also hurt him the most. People thought returning home would be a journey of healing, but for Pedro Martinez, it was a return to the deepest wounds, wounds that titles, money, or MLB glory could never cover. When the plane landed in Santo Domingo and Pedro went back to Managuayabo, the place where he once ran barefoot on hot dirt, where his mother once divided handfuls of beans so the whole family could survive another day, he saw things his heart was never ready to face. Dominican children just like him. As a boy, skinny to the bone, eyes yellow from illness, feet cracked, living amid leaky tin-roofed houses. The first thing they asked Pedro was not for an autograph, not for baseball, but, "Sir, help me." A small sentence, but enough to tear a legend's heart into pieces. Pedro stood in the cracked village roads, watching children play with empty stomachs, watching neighbors cough and gasp from simple infections with no money for medicine, watching women holding babies in their arms, begging for a miracle. And then, that question, the question he had suppressed, ever since entering MLB, surfaced so powerfully, it took his breath away. Why do I live while they die? Pedro could never hide the truth that his success was a rare exception, almost impossible. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Dominican children just like him died from the cruelest and most senseless things: hunger, illness, violence, societal indifference. That obsession followed Pedro like a new curse, the curse of the survivor. So Pedro did the only thing he could: use his wealth to save people. But the cruelest part was, the more he saved, the more it hurt. He built schools so children would not grow up in darkness like he had. Modern buildings, new desks, kind teachers. But just a few years after opening, some students Pedro had once put his arm around and encouraged, children he called "my little champions," were shot dead by gangs on the way home from school. They died meaninglessly, like candles snuffed out in the hot Caribbean wind. The day he heard the news, Pedro sat alone in the school office, hands trembling, face buried in his palms, asking over and over, "Why couldn't I save them?" Then he built a medical center, providing free medicine to the poor. He bought ventilators, antibiotics, surgical tools. He paid doctors' salaries out of his own pocket. But there were days when Pedro witnessed people carrying in a gravely ill child, breathing rapidly, eyes wide with fear, and just minutes later, it took its last breath in its mother's arms. Pedro stood there, not as an MLB athlete, but as a completely powerless man. He had tasted pain on the field, but this pain, watching a child die right in front of him, despite pouring his heart into saving it, was the kind that nearly brought him to his knees. A center employee once said that after one death, Pedro walked into the storage room, closed the door, and cried like a child. Not because the center hadn't done enough, but because he thought he himself hadn't done enough. He always blamed himself. If I had earned more money, if I had done more, would that child have lived? There were no scandals in Pedro's life, no controversies, no mistakes that hurt others. But there was a smoldering pain that shattered his heart. The pain of watching his homeland slowly die, even though he had dedicated everything to save it. Every time he returned to the Dominican Republic, he brought gifts, medicine, sponsorships, hope. But he also carried away in his heart a new cut, each one deeper, each one more painful. Because in his eyes, every child lost was a little Pedro who never got to grow up. Every mother wailing was the image of his own mother long ago. Every time he saw his homeland sunk in poverty was another time he heard the echo of the phrase that had haunted him since childhood. Our house has nothing but hunger and hope. Pedro Martinez had brought light to the Dominican Republic, but that very place, the one he loved with his whole life, was also the one that crushed his heart without mercy. But the pains Pedro carried in his heart did not come only from Dominican children dying in poverty. His life, like a cruel fate, was always shrouded in death, layer upon layer, weighing on his soul until it had almost no room left to breathe. And no matter how strong he was on the field, Pedro Martinez was one of the most vulnerable people when facing loss. The first person he lost, and the one who hurt him the most, was his first coach, the man who looked at Pedro and saw what scouts, the Dodgers, and the whole world at that time did not see. A genius buried under poverty and prejudice. It was he who told Pedro, "You're not small. You're just not being seen the right way." That coach taught Pedro his first pitches, taught him how to overcome fear, taught him to believe in himself when the whole world did not. And then, while Pedro was struggling in the minor leagues, he received news that his coach had passed away from heart disease. Pedro went numb. He never got to say a final thank you, never got to show his coach who he had become. For many years after, Pedro would often look up at the sky after every win and whisper, "I wish you were alive to see me today." But the death of his coach was only the beginning of an endless chain of losses. When successful, Pedro returned to the Dominican Republic to find his childhood friends. Those children who had run on dusty roads with him, shared charity bread, passed around old rubber balls. But when he came back, those faces were no longer enough to piece together memories. One shot dead by a gang. One died from infection. One died in a traffic accident while working at age 16. One disappeared, still unknown to this day. Pedro stood in the old village, looking at the ever-shortening list of friends, and the question from before returned like a storm. Why do I live, while they don't? In his memories, his childhood friends were always smiling. But now, in adult memory, they were only small dirt graves marked by crooked wooden planks. Then came the greatest tragedy in the later years of his career, the death of a young player he had mentored. That boy Pedro called him "Mi hijo del béisbol," my baseball son, was a shining talent, dreaming of the MLB like Pedro once had, and fully sponsored by Pedro for tuition, equipment, training. The boy called him Papi. Then one day, The boy fell ill. Cancer. The vicious kind that the Dominican Republic lacked the equipment to treat. Pedro paid all medical costs, flew the boy to the United States for treatment, even knelt to thank doctors when they offered even the slimmest chance. But the miracle did not happen. The boy passed away in his mother's arms, and Pedro received the call in the middle of the night. He could not speak. He just gripped the phone tightly and breathed in despair. If only I had helped more. If only I had taken him sooner. If only I were stronger. That if only haunted him for the rest of his life, like a ghost that would never fade. Pedro had won the Cy Young, had broken the Boston curse, had become a global icon. But no title helped him endure those deaths. No award made him feel less like a lone survivor in a world where the people he loved left one by one. In this chapter, the darkness surrounding Pedro was exactly like the darkness surrounding Simon Cowell when Liam Payne passed away, not because of scandal, not because of mistakes, but because someone he loved was taken by fate, without warning, without mercy. But unlike Simon, Pedro had to endure that many times throughout his entire life. He did not just lose one person, he lost an entire world. Pedro Martinez had fought the Yankees, the curse, injuries, poverty, but the one enemy he could never defeat was those deaths, the invisible wounds that made his heart bleed every day, even as he still smiled at life. At the age of 54, Pedro entered a chapter of life where no cheers echoed anymore, no lights shone down on the grass, only him and a body that no longer obeyed, a body now demanding payment for the price he had owed it through more than 2 decades of tormenting it. The pain at this age was no longer like the pain from his playing days. Back then, pain was the price paid for victory. But now, pain was a reminder that old age was approaching, very close, like a cold shadow following behind him. Pedro's right shoulder, the thing that had once been his most powerful weapon, the thing that defeated the Yankees, rewrote Boston history, and made all of MLB fear him, was now almost no longer his. There were days when Pedro tried to lift his child to hug him, but his hand shook too much, his shoulder hurt too much, and he had to let go midway. The little boy laughed innocently, but Pedro stood frozen, his heart aching as if someone was squeezing it. Can't I even hold my child? Can't I do even this small thing anymore? That truth cut into him deeper than any missed strikeout. His back was like a rotten plank of wood. Every night, Pedro woke up from sudden pain. Pain running from his lower back up to his neck, forcing him to sit up, breathing in short gasps, as if an invisible hand was tightening around his spine. There were nights when Pedro had to stand leaning against the wall for nearly an hour, hands gripping the edge of the table to stay balanced, because lying down hurt, walking hurt, even breathing hurt. He had once thrown 120 pitches in the freezing cold of Yankee Stadium without trembling, but now just bending down to tie his shoelaces made him sweat from dizziness. Deep inside, Pedro carried a new fear, the fear of losing the ability to walk, not because he feared disability, but because he feared not being able to run after his son in the yard, feared not being able to stand up to hug his wife who was encouraging him, feared that one day he would have to watch his child play baseball from a reclining chair, motionless, powerless. But the greatest, cruelest fear was the one all fathers understand, the fear of not seeing his child grow up. Pedro had once faced death while pitching with a torn shoulder. He had lost friends, lost protégés, lost those he loved, but never had he feared life this much when he realized that death could come in a moment when he could no longer fight it off. A heart attack, a fall, a night when his back locked up and he could not get up. If that happened, who would he leave behind? That question tormented Pedro every time he looked at his son, sleeping peacefully in his arms. And then there were mornings when Pedro stood in front of the mirror, not the MLB legend, not the icon of the Dominican Republic, but just an aging man, hair already gray, face full of wrinkles, eyes no longer bright like before. He touched his hair, the wrinkles, the marks of time, and for the first time in his life, he clearly felt the fading. This feeling was exactly like the moment Simon Cowell saw his face after the accident, realizing that the invulnerable strength had vanished. Pedro was the same. But for Pedro, that pain was not in his appearance. It was in the question, do I still have enough time to teach my child to grow up? In the past, Pedro's pain was in bones, in tendons, in muscles. Now, that pain was in his heart. It was in the moments he walked slower, stood up with more difficulty, needed to rest midway on paths he once could run without stopping. It was in the feeling of helplessness, seeing a once defiant body now tremble under the weight of years. At 54, Pedro did not fear the Yankees, did not fear the curse, did not fear pitches that hurt like being stabbed. He only feared not having enough time left with those he loved. On the field, he was a warrior. But in front of the mirror, amid old wounds, sleepless nights, and the fear of losing the future, Pedro Martinez was left with the starkest truth. Even legends must face old age, and no victory can protect them from it. At 54, when the pains forced Pedro to slow down, to confront each new limit of his body, he began looking back at everything he had been through, and understood that his career, his legend, his life, were not built from victories, but from pain, loneliness, and endurance to a devastating degree. People often say the greatest pitchers are born from talent, but for Pedro, talent was only the seed. What nurtured it was the nights he trembled from hunger in Managuayabo, the hours of being mocked in the minor leagues, the years carrying the burden of Boston and the torn shoulder pain, the piling deaths, and the encroaching fear of old age. That was the true foundation of Pedro Martinez, a foundation no one wants, but only people like him are strong enough to carry for life. And the most miraculous thing, his true legacy, was that Pedro did not choose hatred. He had every reason to resent life, being looked down on for being Latino, being called too small, being traded like useless goods, being thrust into the pressure of breaking the 86-year curse, being betrayed by his body, watching friends, protégés die, right in the arms of despair. But Pedro did not let those pains turn into bitterness. He did not build a power empire like many other famous people, did not build a personal brand, did not live off scandal, did not use his spotlight to get revenge on those who once doubted him. Instead, he chose a different path, the path of compassion. Pedro understood all too well the feeling of being abandoned, isolated, seen as someone with no future, and he did not want any child in the Dominican Republic to carry that feeling. So, instead of building resorts, instead of investing in entertainment or business like many other superstars, he built schools. A school that did not just teach letters, but taught hope. He built each classroom, each ball field, each dormitory, each library, all just so Dominican children had a safe place to dream. But he did not stop there. He built hospitals because he had witnessed too many people die from simple illnesses. He paid nurses' salaries, bought surgical equipment, sponsored medicine. He went into every alley, met every family, listened to every painful story. He did not do charity for fame. He did it because it was the only way he knew to soothe the ghosts his childhood had planted in his heart. While the entertainment world built empires from money, Pedro built an empire from lives saved, from children taught to read, from mothers who did not have to bury their children. That was his empire. An empire that did not bear his name on the sign, but carried him in every breath of those he helped. And then, in 2015, when Pedro stepped onto the Hall of Fame induction, staged the highest honor a baseball player can receive, he did not step up with a proud posture. He stepped up with a humble, slow gait, eyes already red before the ceremony began. In that moment, before thousands of people, Pedro looked at the plaque engraved with his name, looked at the legends who came before, and he cried, not because he was proud, not because he saw himself as great, but because he saw again the entire journey that had brought him here. The skinny boy running under the Dominican sun, the teenager rejected after just 5 minutes of tryouts, the lonely young man sleeping in a rundown dormitory, the pitcher with a torn shoulder still throwing 96 miles per hour to save Boston, the man who lost friends, lost protégés, lost a piece of his heart every time he returned home, and the 54-year-old father worried every time he could not lift his child. In that Hall of Fame moment, Pedro understood something more important than anything. His legacy was not the strikeouts, not the Cy Youngs, not 2004. The true legacy of Pedro Martinez was the way he turned pain into compassion, turned hurt into hope, and turned loneliness into support for an entire generation. When even his body could no longer stand firm, when age took away speed, strength, and the years he had left with his son, Pedro still kept the one thing no time could defeat: the heart of a man who chose love over hate. And precisely that is why the whole world will remember Pedro Martinez, not just as a baseball legend, but as proof of the power of compassion in a world full of loss. Pedro Martinez's entire life, when looked back upon from the age of 54 filled with pain and sleepless nights, appears like an epic tragedy, a tragic epic written by small hands but carrying the strength of an entire nation. He began as a poor boy, running barefoot on the dusty red roads of Managuayabo, living amid hunger, illness, and violence, carrying in his heart a question no child should have: will I still be alive tomorrow? But from those very shadows, from the missed meals, from the flickering oil lamps and gunshots every night, Pedro burst forth like a spark no one could extinguish. That spark carried the 39-kilogram boy into the world of American baseball, a world not meant for small bodies, a world full of prejudice and contempt. But that underestimated teenager, the one scouts once waved away after just 5 minutes of tryouts, the one who walked kilometers for a chance, turned his frail body into steel will, turned mockery into fuel, to throw pitches that pierced through history. Pedro did not grow because people believed in him. He grew because they did not from a launching pad, but from his deepest wounds, not from wealth, but from poverty, like a shadow that never left. And then, that boy became an MLB icon, one of the most fearsome pitchers of all time, the man who turned Montreal into a springboard, Boston into a cathedral, Yankee Stadium into a battlefield where he faced an entire empire, the one who won Cy Youngs, broke the 86-year curse, and etched his name into the Hall of Fame as a brilliant chapter in United States baseball history. But behind Pedro's light, there was always darkness the nights he lay, convulsing in pain, the times he could not lift his child, the moments looking in the mirror and seeing a man aging too quickly from what he had traded away. Light and darkness in his life were not separate. They twisted together, merged into each other, making his life cruel but beautiful proof. No legend is created from ease. The suffering he endured, the loneliness in the minor leagues, the humiliation of being traded like trash, the cold nights in Montreal, the boos like knives stabbing at Yankee Stadium, the torn shoulder pain while carrying Boston, the loss watching the Dominican Republic sink in poverty, all of it did not make him bitter. On the contrary, it made him more humane. Instead of building an empire, he built schools. Instead of retreating into wealth, he built hospitals. Instead of hating life, he chose to love it. Pedro Martinez was not just a winner, he was a healer. And now, at 54, Pedro carries within him everything life has thrown at him, as if testing how much his heart could bear. Physical pain, torn shoulder, stiffened back, nights unable to sleep from sharp pain running from vertebrae down his legs. Spiritual wounds, the deaths of his coach, his friends, the children he had supported. The debt to his homeland, an indescribable torment. Why do I live while they die? Love for his child, the fear of not having enough time to watch him grow up, to be the father he always longed to become. But even carrying all those burdens, Pedro still stands firm, not like the pitcher of 1999, not like the warrior of 2004, but like a man who deeply understands the meaning of suffering. A man who knows that pain is not the enemy, it is the material to build compassion, resilience, forgiveness, and a heart that knows how to love. Pedro Martinez walked through darkness to create light, walked through suffering to create hope, walked through broken years to create a legacy no stadium could fully contain. That legacy is not in strikeouts, not in titles, not in championships. That legacy is in the children who get to go to school, the sick who are saved, the families who are helped, the hearts he has touched. When Pedro looks back on his life, it is not the pitches straight into the strike zone that make him most proud. It is the tears of the poor when he visits. It is the smile of a Dominican boy holding a glove for the first time in his life. It is his son's laughter every morning when he wakes up. And that is also the message Pedro wants to send to the country that became his second home, the people of the United States. Glory is not measured by titles, but by the hearts we touch. That is a reminder from a small man who carried the expectations of millions on his shoulders, who overcame pains most of us cannot imagine, and who chose the path of love over bitterness. Pedro Martinez, a legend not just of baseball, but of compassion. A small hero carrying the weight of an entire nation. The story of Pedro Martinez is not just the journey of a great athlete, but the beautiful tragedy of a human being who used his entire life to fight darkness. When we see Pedro smiling on the field, we do not see the Managuayabo boy who witnessed friends die from illness. Do not see the teenager mocked by scouts after just 5 minutes of tryouts. Do not see the man who once lay convulsing on the floor after every game from a 40% torn shoulder. I do not see the nights he knelt in the rehabilitation room after the 2006 surgery, asking himself, if I no longer have baseball, what do I have left? It is precisely those details that let us understand that Pedro did not reach glory by magic. He reached it with blood, tears, and a will beyond human limits. But what makes Pedro great is not in the victory of 2004 or the ticket to the Hall of Fame in 2015. Greatness lies in how he faced pain, not turning it into hatred, but into compassion. In the end, he returned to the Dominican Republic to build schools, open medical centers, save children just like he once was. Even though every time he saved a life, he had to bear more pain seeing others who did not make it in time. Even though at 54, his body could no longer lift his son, he still stood firm to be a support for the poor back home. And it is these details that give the people of the United States a profound lesson, that glory does not lie in titles, not in cheers, but in the compassion we sow into the world. Life can take away health, career, youth, as it took from Pedro. But if each of us chooses love over hate, help over judgment, compassion over bitterness, then no matter how harsh life is, we will still leave a legacy that makes others bow in respect. If Pedro Martinez's journey full of blood, tears, and compassion has moved you, please subscribe to continue joining us in exploring real people, real-life stories full of strength. Thank you for following along. See you in the next video, where we continue to honor small people with great hearts.